Hi guys, so obviously as I said at the end of the last session, what I'm going to do next is just to talk you through a few key moments in the play, some lines which are useful to understanding the presentation of different types of power in the play. I could have picked loads because so much of the play is about this idea of power and how power is used and abused, but I've had to pick a few to focus on. I suggest you make a few notes as we go, but you will have learnt these ideas before, just not necessarily in this way. You would have looked at them within the context of the play, perhaps, rather than linked together as around this idea of power. Okay, so at the end of the last session, I spoke to you about power in terms of physical power, and we see that straight away with Macbeth. So before Macbeth appears on stage, before as an audience we get to meet this character, Shakespeare introduces him to us through the captain, a reliable source who tells us about Macbeth and presents him as this hugely impressive, powerful character. He says lots of impressive things about him. I've just picked this one line. His brandished steel which smoked with bloody execution. I like the gory bits. So obviously his brandished steel, his sword, his weapon of choice, the weapon of a soldier, not a sneaky dagger that he has later, but a weapon that's of heroism and power. And obviously we've got this slightly dramatic image of it smoking with bloody execution. And at this stage of the play, it's important to remember that blood is a symbol of power. Because for Macbeth to be wearing the blood of his enemies, to have been able to destroy them so brutally and effectively, shows his masculinity and his physical power. And obviously the idea that his sword smoked suggests him as this kind of deadly predator type, doesn't it? So we already get the sense of Macbeth as a very violent character, but in a way that's celebrated by the standards of the age. Now this is quite short-lived, because when we then, quite quickly after that, we meet Macbeth, and he meets the witches, and we see a very different side to him. And Banquo is the vehicle through which Shakespeare helps us to understand a little bit more about Macbeth. He says, "Good sir," talking to Macbeth, "why do you start and seem to fear things that do sound so fair?" So the witches have just predicted that Macbeth's going to be a future king. Now, obviously the word fear is not really the word of power, is it? We get a sense straight away here of Macbeth being almost immediately submissive to these women, to these witches. He then says to the witches, "In the name of truth, are ye fantastical, or that indeed which outwardly ye show? My noble partner you greet with present grace and great prediction of noble having and of royal hope, that he seems rapt withal." And I think that's another interesting detail, because it suggests he's almost entranced by them. He's completely taken by not necessarily them, but what they've got to say, the great predictions of noble and royal hope. Which helps us, I think, understand maybe why Macbeth looks fearful. A warrior, a soldier of Macbeth's impressive power, probably not afraid of three strange women on the heath. Perhaps what Shakespeare's showing us here is he's actually afraid of his own ambition. He's afraid already of what he could be capable of, which has been awoken by the witch's prediction. So powerful Macbeth, but then a very different Macbeth, much more fearful, perhaps fearful of himself rather than of others. The next character we meet, who we see in relation to power, is Lady Macbeth. Macbeth writes to Lady Macbeth and he tells her about these predictions. And Lady Macbeth delivers this super dark soliloquy, doesn't she, in which she attempts to suppress her goodness and empower herself. She says, "Come, you spirits that tend your mortal thoughts, unsex me here." She doesn't actually want to change genders here. What Lady Macbeth wants is to embrace her masculine side. That side which is defined by power and brutality and strength. That's what she wants to summon from within herself. "And fill me from the crown to the toe top full of direst cruelty. Make thick my blood." Now, the fact that Lady Macbeth is asking the spirits to fill her with cruelty suggests goodness, doesn't it? She's not innately a bad character, because if she wants to be filled with cruelty, suggests that's not her nature. And then obviously this reference again to blood. Blood we've already seen with Macbeth, symbolising his power, and with Lady Macbeth, her desire to be more powerful. And that's really at the heart of everything, isn't it, with Lady Macbeth, and understanding her motivation. Her motivation to persuade Macbeth to kill the king is aligned with a desire for power. Of course, she obviously then becomes very proactive, and we see her power when plotting the murder of Duncan. She says, "This night's great business into my dispatch." She's taking the lead, which shall to all our nights and days to come give solely sovereign sway and masterdom. Now, sovereign basically means royalty, being the king and queen. So again, we can see her motivation here. It's not about cruelty as such, it's not about murder, it's about that ultimate form of power, royal power. And as a woman living in a patriarchal world, who probably or possibly feels hugely frustrated by the parameters of her world and the smallness of her world, perhaps we can understand her desire for masterdom and her sense that achieving that is going to be more likely through her having a royal status. Now, of course, Macbeth isn't too sure, or he claims to be not too sure. The fact he's persuaded so easily always makes me think it's basically what he wants anyway. But he does, at the end, towards the end of Act 1, tell Lady Macbeth that we shall proceed no further with this business, that he's not willing to kill the king. Then we have that persuasion scene. We see Lady Macbeth powerful in her ability to influence another, but obviously also the fact she has to persuade him is also simultaneously a sign of her powerlessness. She cannot act of her own accord. She has to rely on persuading him because he is the man. So the persuasion scene is incredibly interesting for power, powerful in her behaviour, powerful in her emotional persuasion, but fundamentally lacking the power to act alone. Obviously in here again, she talks about being royal. She talks about the ornament of life, the crown. The most precious thing potentially that one can have is royal power, because ultimately it's the most significant form of power you could have within that society. And of course, after the murder, we see power really interesting between this couple. Macbeth completely is disempowered by his act. He goes in, he kills the king, and instantly regrets it. He wishes he hadn't done it, he feels completely guilty, he's seeing blood on his hands, and as a consequence of that, he messes up the plan. He brings the daggers away from the body when the whole plan was to frame the guards. Now, Lady Macbeth then becomes powerful. Lady Macbeth seizes the moment to be the agent, to be the actor of the event, rather than just the persuader. She initially tells Macbeth to carry the daggers back to Duncan's body and smear the grooms with his blood, because she wants them to look like they did it. And obviously she knows that if they're in the room without any blood on them, it's not going to be very convincing. Macbeth says, "I'll go no more. I am afraid to think what I have done. I dare not." So we see again that clear sense of he's lost his power as an internal power because he's so upset by what he's done. I'm always interested in these lines of Lady Macbeth. "If he do bleed, I'll gild the faces of the grooms withal, for it must seem their guilt." Now I find this interesting because of the contrast between the fact that she initially told Macbeth to smear the guards, which is a pretty unattractive verb choice. But when she talks about herself doing it, she says she'll gild. Now, to gild something means to cover it in gold. And that clearly relates to King Duncan's blood. As the king, his blood is precious. However, the fact she uses this verb to describe her using his blood suggests to me that she feels empowered by this moment, that she feels almost like the artist, the creator of the scene, and having his blood on her hands, having his blood to manipulate in this way is a moment of power for Lady Macbeth. Skip forward then to Act 3, we see Macbeth at this point, in theory, is externally powerful. He is the king. No one can do anything to him. but we see that his internal power is completely gone. He says, to be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus. Our fears in Banquo stick deep. Obviously, at this point, he's organising the murder of Banquo because of his fears in Banquo. And the key thing here is he doesn't feel safe. He doesn't feel a sense of control and power in his position as king. Largely, obviously, because of the witch's prediction that Banquo's sons would succeed him, in a sense, that Banquo's heirs will go on to be king. In this period, succession was really important. So we see Macbeth's sense that having power in the moment isn't enough. To have power long term, he needs to know that he's got a line of succession. And then the line I always say we can adapt to so many different contexts in Macbeth, "Oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife." Again, this line represents his powerlessness, doesn't it? His own sense of powerlessness internally. He doesn't even feel like he's got control of his own thoughts. Lady Macbeth, but at that point she tries to reassure her husband, she tries to hold it together, but by Act 5 she's seen her husband, her once noble, powerful, heroic husband, brutally murder women and children. Now, she hasn't seen it, but likelihood is she's aware of it. And I always think that Lady Macbeth's guilt doesn't actually derive from the murder of Duncan, but from the destruction of her husband. She realises that by persuading Macbeth to kill Duncan, she has destroyed him. And in her sleepwalking scene, she says, "What need we fear who knows it when none can call our power to account?" So she's talking there about the fact that he's the king. Even if people suspect him, they can't do anything because he's the king. However, we've got this yet here, haven't we? This however moment. Who would have thought the old man to have had so much blood in him? Blood at this point representing guilt, in a sense. I think who would have thought that his death, Duncan's murder, would have led to such dire consequences, to such guilt and such evil manifesting itself in Macbeth? And then the last line I've picked to talk about is in Act 5, Scene 3. Macbeth realises that power achieved through immoral acts is actually empty. He talks about the fact that in old age, people should look to have honour, love, obedience, troops of friends, all of the things he had at the beginning. But then he says, I must not look to have. So Macbeth realises by Act 5 that actually power, when stolen, being an illegitimate king who has committed an act of regicide to achieve it, actually hasn't brought him the power he dreamed of, hasn't fulfilled his ambitions. It's actually destroyed him, in a sense. So through that, we can see how Shakespeare is showing the complete destruction created by the subversion of power structures. Okay, so I'm sure you've got other lines, other ideas as well, which is wonderful, but they're just a few that I've picked out I think are really interesting around the idea of not only how power ebbs and flows throughout this play, but also the difference between external and internal power, and also ideas about the destructive consequences of power. What I'd like to do you to do that last, in order to check your understanding of the big question, is the close activity. So you will see on this screen coming up, this one, there's a close activity, and the words are here on the left of the screen. I've also numbered all of the gaps. So to save you copying out all of this, all you need to do is to pause it, to write out the numbers 1 to 10, and then to put the words that go in the gaps next to the numbers. Of course, if you'd like to copy it all out, super. But if not, you can just do it with the numbers. So please pause this screen and do that activity. Okay, please can you now self-assess that? Can you please check that you've got the right words in the right places? If you have any issues or problems with this session, please email your English teacher first and foremost, because they will be glad to help you and answer any questions. Hopefully, we've got your mental juices flowing, got you thinking about power, ready for the next session, which will be applying some of this to an exam task. Thank you very much.